Around.
Welcome. Zaidi Sechito and Nakaiza Jacqueline, are you there? So I think I'll give each of us 10 minutes, and that will enable us go through the presentation, and then we shall have the question and answer session after all the presentation. We are in the breakout session 2A, looking at global trends in interdisciplinary research and governance, security, peace, and conflict 2. I'll welcome the first presenter present, Albert. Albert?
Yes.
Yes, unmute and make your presentation. You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Chair. This is Albert Ochino Kinda, and I'm going to present. Allow me to share my screen. Host disabled. Okay, I'll just share. I'll just present from my side. Just a moment. So
please you can share. I have enabled the sharing. Sorry,
okay,
I hadn't done that yet. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. Thank you for allowing me to share. My topic is on governing by use of parallel security regimens, the case of pastoral communities along the llemi Triangle. So the word llemi Triangle, it's derived from a word from the Anuak community. They are found in South Sudan. And the llemi Triangle is one of those regions that has been highly contested among three nations, that is Kenya, Uganda, and actually for three, but the other one is silent about it: Kenya, South Sudan, Uganda, and Ethiopia. So, and this area is mostly dominated by pastoral communities who live in arid and semi-arid areas, and mostly they practice livestock rearing because the climatic conditions in those areas can only allow that particular mode of production rather than the agricultural based production. So to be practiced effectively, pastoralism depends on freedom of movement from all herds between pastures and water sources, which is usually facilitated through some form of common property administration. And this one was mostly common in the African traditional setup, but things have changed as per now. So you find that the borderlands that connect Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, and Ethiopia are majorly drylands inhabited by the pastoral communities whose social and economic life is structured around the maintenance and well-being of their livestock. So this paper focuses on the llemi Triangle, which is one of those areas in the llemi Triangle, which is those areas that borders South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya. So let's look at, or try to look at more about llemi Triangle. So llemi Triangle is a region along the Kenyan South Sudan and Ethiopia border, and has for a long time been considered a theater of violent conflicts over pasture, forage, and land. Communities from each of the three countries are pastoralists, who by and large remain relatively marginalized by their national governments. And I would want to imagine, if we'll be looking at the map, you'll see at the point where llemi Triangle relies. So for the case of the Kenyan government, it's usually at the periphery. It's not an issue of concern until something comes up. So this has seen the communities develop and continue to rely on their indigenous governance and security provisions, because in most cases they are marginalized by the government. The security apparatus are barely functioning in those particular areas. So they have to rely on themselves in terms of security provision, and we'll see also onto that. So the use of traditional security system involves reliance on elders, cultural norms, elders and the cultural demands determine when and with whom the raiders are to engage in war with. Like they're the ones who determine and define the norms of engaging in cattle rustling, because this one has been one of the sources of the conflicts in the region apart from pasture and water. So superimposed within this indigenous indigenous community is the security regimen by the national government, because the national governments want to control this area, but the community members from these areas, they usually do not identify those institutions superimposed by the national government. Why? Because they always feel that they are marginalized or are at the periphery, so the government should not interfere with their welfare by the fact that they are marginalized. So this is llemi triangle, and its borders or the lines have been changing over time. And maybe the first case was in 1902 when the first line was drawn when it was flat. So it was called the Maud line of 1902. Then the 1932, there was also, it was redrawn. 1938, it was also redrawn above. 1947, that is after the Second World War, it was now redrawn. And why was it redrawn in 1938, 1947? It was to allow the Turkanas to get access to the pastures and waters that were lying in other regions. And the redrawing of this boundary became a source of conflict or between and among the communities that live in Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Kenya. And these communities are the likes of Toposa, the Dasenech, and the Turkanas that inhabit this region, because it kept on shifting. And this was became a recipe for chaos, because there was the contestation who has the control of those resources. And there was the feeling that the colonial state, that is Kenya under Britain, was favoring the Turkana in terms of access to the resources within that particular region. So where, like the genesis of all this, where does the problem lie? So one thing is that it is a legacy of colonialism in Africa, because most of the boundaries during colonial period were drawn arbitrarily without giving consideration to the different communities that were going to be affected by those boundaries. Like in the case of East Africa, if you're to pick the Maasais in Kenya, we have Maasais in Kenya, we have Maasais in Tanzania. We have the Kenyan Somali, we have the Somalis. We have the Pokot in Kenya, we have the Pokot in Uganda. The same with Turkanas, they have their brothers, the Dasenech, the Toposa, and others who were, as a result of these boundaries, they were separated. And when that separation occurred, these people who were formerly brothers and sisters started fighting among themselves in terms of pastures, control of the natural resources, especially in this case, the livestock, the access to pasture, the access to water, because pastoralism is their main source of economic activity, because the region where they inhabit, it's predominantly dry and rainfalls are erratic. So that's the only mode of livelihood that they know. So this, the llemi Triangle is just a piece of land joining South Sudan, formerly part of Sudan, Kenya, and Ethiopia. It is described in some records measuring 400 square kilometers and 320 square kilometers in others. So it was named after Chief Llemi of the Anuak community in South Sudan. So both South Sudan and Kenya lay claim to the piece of land. And actually this came out in 2011 when South Sudan had attained their independence. So they revived that idea that that particular area belongs to them. And you know, some people have even argued that because of the South Sudan is embroiled in internal conflict. Now they're not focusing on llemi Triangle, and that's why the discussion about the region is so silent. So nobody talks about it. But probably if the South Sudanese was to become stable, maybe the conversation will be revived. So the area is home to pastoral communities like the Didinka, Toposa of South Sudan, the Nyangatom, and Dasenech of Ethiopia, who traditionally migrate and graze in the triangle. And one of the areas why there is contestation is this, or what causes the conflict among these communities that reside within the region. They easily move across borders. Why? Because those areas are dry and they have to move in search of pastures. But there is that the politics of autochthony, where some communities lay claim to those particular lands that they're the original inhabitants and those resources belong to them. So in the event any other community will want to access it, conflict will always arise. So you find that the law over the region is rooted in the unclear wording of the 1914 treaty, which extended the 1902 boundary northwards that moved the Maudlin northwards. And why was it moved northwards? It was moved northwards because they wanted to increase the Turkana's access to pasture and waters within the region. So however, in 1931, the traditional grazing ground of Turkana in llemi Triangle was further defined by a drawing, a red line representing the northern limits of the Turkana grazing. A few months later, there was the 1932 one, there was the 1947 one, there was the one for 1970. So you find that the llemi Triangle has been closely redrawn to, I think, 5 times. And every time it is redrawn, there are different contesting claims by these communities because they feel one community is being favored over the other. Some of these methods were based on negotiations between the British and the Empire of Ethiopia. So, and you find that in this redrawing, and also this system of colonial government where the central administration was introduced. This was imposed on these communities with total disregard of their social realities. Because these are people who used to move freely across borders. Now you draw boundaries. You are telling them you can't go beyond. So what emerges? Everybody will start laying claim and different contestation in regards to that particular area arises and conflict will take place. So these boundaries were divided communities who during pre-colonial period were brothers and sisters. So, but even with that, there was attempt to try to resolve.
Albert, you're left with 2 minutes.
Okay, it's fine. So you find that these communities, when these boundaries were drawn, and also the imposition of the central administrative system of governance on them, conflict arose. Why so? Because in the post-independent Kenya and in the post-independent Horn of Africa, most of the pastoral communities have always been marginalized, and they always do not feel a sense of belonging or recognizing the central administration or the national government. So what do they always do? They always come with parallel regimen. And this has been enhanced by the proliferation of small arms in the region. Like we know the conflict in Somalia, the one in South Sudan, and the others have always created, led to the proliferation of small arms in the hands of the civilians. And these pastoralist communities have acquired these weapons. Why? In the name of protecting themselves and their livestock. Why do they do that? Because they have been neglected by the central government. So they feel that they need to protect themselves. And in the process of protecting themselves, they kind of create an arms race because a security for one person probably becomes a threat for the other person. Because if the other person is armed, then the other person will perceive them that why are they armed? It's now they're posing a threat to them. So they will also arm themselves in the name of protecting themselves, because in most cases they have been neglected by the central governments, because where the region is found, and also it is found, or it lies at a point where it's kind of in a quagmire, where they're almost at the epicenter of the conflicts in the Horn of Africa. So you find that, like the case for Kenya, you find like the Turkana communities, they have come up with what we call Dengoroko, where they try to protect themselves, because they know very well if a community was to raid them, then the security agencies will take long to respond, or probably will never respond. And in some cases, you have there are stories that the security agencies deployed in those areas have always been accused or reduced to the fact that they resolve domestic disputes rather than handling the disputes that exist between or among these communities within this region. So these communities are left helpless, so they have to govern themselves. And in order to protect themselves and the community, they have acquired weapons. So, and in that acquisition of weapons, they create a threat to the others. So they have to find ways to survive. But there is one thing also we have to note, that the acquisition of small arms has led to the erosion of the traditional conflict management mechanisms. Why? Because if I have a gun, would I listen to the elders? Because traditionally, these elders were respected. But with the proliferation of small arms, it gives you some unfettered power. So the youth, when the arms fall in the hands of the youth, they have so much power. So they do not recognize these traditional institutions of conflict resolution, which has equally been weakened by the imposition of the central administration by the national government, of which is not recognized by these communities in most cases, because they feel the government ignores them. So you find that these institutions, like the traditional mechanisms of conflict resolution, have weakened, and what has replaced them is kind of a predatory kind of leadership, where it is us versus them. And this one always comes in the case for the context of Kenya, whenever there is election time, where the boundaries were redrawn. And when we approach the elections, like the levels of cattle rustling increases. Why? Because we want to deal with our perceived enemy, who is neither here nor there, so that they do not get to vote for a particular potential candidate. So, and also these predatory leaderships in these regions have always tended to arm those youths in those regions for their own purpose, either for commercial cattle rustling or in the name of the protecting the community. But in doing so, it also poses a threat to other community, causing arms race. So what is my conclusion and recommendations that I have? So the boundary of the triangle is byproduct of artificial boundaries drawn arbitrarily by the colonial masters. Kenya has the de facto control over the region. The governance of the region requires a multi-pronged approach because it lies almost in 4 countries. So they need to work together, because these communities that live in that area need to access the water and pasture in other areas because of the nature of the environment there. Even though traditional approaches to mitigating protracted conflicts over pasture and water may be important, they rarely take into account the contemporary dynamics and drivers of cattle rustling. Like one, commercialized cattle rustling, and also the use of small arms and light weapons. Additionally, the governments, that's South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya, will need, just a second, will need to work together in order to deal with the situation at the llemi triangle. So that will define how are they going to work with the elders, what kind of institutions of governance they are going to impose or put in place, and that should be done in consultation with the community members from that particular region, because at the end of the day, they need to share the resources that lies there. And thank you, Chair. That's all.
Thank you so much, Albert Ocheng, for this interesting presentation. For those who have questions, kindly write them in the chat and we'll pick them up from there. Now I'd like to invite the second presenter, Chori Weilenga. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I need permission to start my video. It's not working at the moment.
Dr. Mayende, are you there to give us technical support? Yeah, thank you.
Let's see. Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, but I have the feeling you can't see my video. I'm not sure. Okay, so I don't have permission to start the video, but at least you can see my PowerPoint.
Would you like to change it into presentation mode?
Okay. Is it in presentation mode?
Okay, great.
Okay.
Continue.
Okay, I just want to apologize for my voice. I have allergies because it's springtime here. So I apologize for that. Unfortunately, I can't start, or let me just see. Okay, let me begin. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you.
please.
Okay,
We can hear
wonderful.
you.
I just want to especially thank Albert for his presentation, and it reminded me also of Agatha's presentation, both looking at the role of indigenous conflict resolution systems, and in fact it will also be relevant in my presentation about Burundi. So I'm looking at land and identity conflict in Burundi, and I wanted to look at it a little bit through the lens of Johan Galtung, who writes about positive and negative peace. So just to give a little bit of the context of the Burundian case. So during the political conflicts in Burundi from the early 1970s to the late 1990s, around 800...
Excuse me, Karen.
Yes.
Excuse me, Karen. Maybe you can put this presentation in the presentation mode. Is it fine? I've just...
Thank you. I think that the reason I'm unable to do that is because I need to read my notes.
Okay.
Is that okay? Okay, as long as you can see it. Okay, so let me go back. If we're looking at the problem of land in Burundi, it is all to do with the people who are fleeing the country. So during the political conflicts in Burundi from the early 1970s to the late 1990s, some 800,000 Burundians fled the country, becoming refugees in neighboring countries, and most notably in Tanzania. 300,000 people fled Burundi in 1972, following massacres of Hutu elite by the Burundian army. Another 400,000 fled in 1993 after the assassination of President Dandaye, which resulted in countrywide massacres. And for the next 12 years, Burundi was in a state of civil war, and refugees kept trickling into neighboring countries. So the UNHCR describes this as one of the most protracted refugee situations worldwide, with hundreds of thousands of refugees staying in Tanzania and other neighboring countries for more than 3 decades. So peace negotiations started in 1998, and the Arusha Peace and Reconciliation Agreement was signed in August of 2000. However, peace negotiations continued for several years, and the transitional government was only elected in 2005. Very slowly, the country started to stabilize, and refugees started returning to Burundi voluntarily. But the repatriation process was very slow. Refugees in Tanzania and in other neighboring countries fall into 3 groups. Those who fled in 1972 and have been living in settlements and designated villages. Those who fled in the 1990s and have been living in camps, which slowly have been closing down. And then the self-settled refugees who are outside of the official assistance structures and who are, taking care of themselves outside of the camps or the settlements. Those who fled in 1972 were offered the choice of being naturalized in Tanzania or returning. And interestingly, the vast majority chose to naturalize and stay in Tanzania. 55,000 chose to return to Burundi. So the repatriation of these and all the other refugees from Tanzania and other neighboring countries was intended to be complete by 2009. However, there were still some camps. There was a particular camp in the Kigoma region of Tanzania that was open with 36,000 refugees and only was eventually closed in 2012. And those refugees were forcibly returned. So as is shown on the slide, some naturalized, some voluntarily returned, and some were forcibly returned. The reason why some refused to return, some 100,000 refused to return, is because of fears about land and livelihood. And this brings me to discussing the land crisis in Burundi. The land crisis in Burundi does not only impact the return of refugees from Tanzania, it affects hundreds of thousands of Burundians every day and places a strain on the very fragile stability in that country. Burundi is a very densely populated country. I think it's the most densely populated on the continent, which is highly dependent on agriculture. Land is a contentious issue even without the added pressure of returning refugees. Alongside this, the land that had previously belonged to the refugees has been given to others in their absence. So in 2004, the National Commission of Land and Other Properties was established to try and resolve the land disputes, particularly those involving returnees from Tanzania. To help the hundreds of thousands of returnees, the Commission was set up to avert clashes and conflicts over land which were emerging. And as we can imagine, land in Burundi has economic, cultural, and social significance. And not only is it there for people's livelihoods, but it's also seen as being a gift from one's forefathers, and the place where one's family, where you bury the dead, and which you leave to others that are still to come. So it has great cultural and social significance. According to the land law of 1986, the land becomes yours automatically after 30 years of living on it. This means that for those who fled Burundi in 1972, other people would have taken their land and lived on it for a period of 30 years, and by the time that these people were returning in the 90s. So this means that the returnees cannot fight for their lands through the courts, as they've lost their legal right to it. It has become the legal right of those who have been living on it for 30 years. At the same time, these returnees, this land is the very land where their family members have been buried, that has deep significance, that it's maybe been in their family for many generations. And the only reason they left the land was because of the conflict. And there continue to be clashes between customary law and the land law, the national law, around how this land is governed and how it is distributed. The solution, sorry, this is the wrong slide. The solution by the government is that the land should be divided equally and shared between the current landowner and the returnee, and they're facilitating this process. So basically they're saying whatever land is there, it must be divided in half. Half goes to the current landowner and half goes to the returnee. The problem with this is that the land that people own is already very, very small, and often it's too small for that family who is living there. So if it now has to be divided in half between the returnees and the current landowner, not enough land is left to ensure people's livelihood. In addition to this, current landowners feel that they should be compensated for the loss of their land. But to a large degree, the government sees this intervention of just dividing the land in half as a positive sign of reconciliation, because to date, it's been going fairly peacefully. There hasn't been violent conflicts around this division of land. So the implementation of the Land Commission was a pragmatic but small step in a major crisis. The Commission assumed the courts would finish their work because they were only there for a certain period of time, but it hasn't been sufficient. because the issue is not only a case of justice or of sharing the land equally. It is also the case that people that may have been former enemies in the conflict are now living on the same piece of land, or who are now working that same piece of land for their livelihood. And so there are the deep questions of how to reconcile, how to forgive one another, how to live in peace for the long term. The issue is also conflated with this of ethnic identity. By and large, I was doing interviews in Burundi over several years, and during the interviews, it was very apparent that ethnicity is no longer a major issue in Burundi in terms of dividing people. People have argued that between 1993 and 1999, things were very divided along ethnic lines. But after the peace agreement was signed, and since the late 2000s, ethnic tensions have really changed in Burundi, particularly amongst young people. But across the country, there's a real sense of ethnicity no longer being a dividing factor. Nevertheless, often ethnicity is being utilized by the politicians to divide people. And so the conflation of ethnicity and land has definitely been a continued problem in Burundi. So my last point that I wanted to make is that the part of the problem about the land issue in Burundi and the way that the government has been dealing with this issue is that that there are different understandings of what peace means. So Johan Galtung talked about negative peace being about the absence of direct violence, but positive peace being the presence of harmony, of reconciliation, of true justice, of social justice, a deep kind of justice between all people. And in the case of Burundi, what has happened since the Land Commission was established is that negative peace was achieved. It was true that direct violence in the countryside was stopped because of the way that the land was being divided. But this doesn't mean that positive peace came in its place. So, for example, people are still, the poverty has, because of the way that the land has been divided between returnees and current landowners, the poverty has increased because people have less land to ensure their livelihood. So there are many examples of how negative peace has been achieved, but positive peace has been compromised. And there isn't an increase in social harmony. People are frustrated. People are resentful. There is no sense of that this has been the best solution for everyone. And I just wanted to mention, I wasn't planning to add this in my presentation, but while I was doing interviews, a lot of people spoke about the institution of traditional leadership in Burundi through the Bashinganahe. That is the name of the traditional leaders that operate in Burundi. And many have argued that they could have played a much more central role in the land conflict. But because of the way in which international funders operate, the funding for all of this went to the national government. And so the government was able to put up the Land Commission. But international funders don't have our indigenous or traditional institutions in mind. And so they were sidelined in this whole process. And many have said that that's a missed opportunity, that we really should have worked with the traditional institution, the institution of traditional leadership in Burundi, and because they understand the problems of the land and the way that the land is being utilized far better than the government does. And if they had been involved, perhaps positive peace could have been achieved. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Corey, for your presentation. It's very interesting, and for keeping time. I'll move to the third presenter, Samuel Chikowero and Grace Maina. Are you there?
Thank you, Agatha. Allow me to share. All right. This is our presentation based on our work that is still in progress. Okay. So basically, we are working on land and justice systems in Africa as our case studies. So we would like to focus more on the gender perspective of this aspect. So at the cases that we are focusing on, why these three countries? There are some commonalities, shared histories across these countries that makes our study relevant. So the first thing relates to the customary laws that governs land use and ownership from the pre-colonial throughout the colonial up to the contemporary period. So that is one issue. And then we also have shared histories. These shared colonial histories, the countries under investigation were subjected to colonial land tenure systems that were similar from the British colonialists. And again, we also consider the state's attitude towards alternative justice systems in post-colonial Africa. So the issue here is on the post-colonial governments that are trying to uphold alternative justice systems in the contemporary period. That is why they make good case studies. The post-colonial land reform policies are also key in this discussion. Why? Because after being subjected to this colonial land imbalances and others colonial legislations, the countries under investigation also attempted to redress all those land imbalances across their citizens. Okay, so in the study, by gender, we recognize that gender as a concept is so diverse, but for the purposes of this study now, we use it as a binary between males and females, although we acknowledge the existence of other categories. So for the purpose of the background of this study, we take land as a fundamental resource for human survival. So that is why the land issues, this study is important in this land discussions. It supports the social and economic and as well as political activities of African societies. So it's quite important. Under customary tenure, land was seen as crucial asset for all in order to make ends meet. So this also emphasizes the previous point that land was necessary for human survival. Tenure systems in Africa were the basis for one's access to land under the customary law. It dictates who can use land, under what conditions, and for how long. So the emphasis now is the tenure systems that existed throughout these three historical periods. Evidence from the three case studies that we are dealing with suggests that land could be acquired through inheritance, purchase, or as a form of gift. Gender and kinship relations play a pivotal role in determining land rights and production relations in many African societies. So here we consider the access to land, which is mainly based on the kinship relations and the gender. However, the access and ownership to these resources now has been a center of controversy over this. Among the various means of land acquisition mechanisms, inheritance now continue to be a dominant form across these three cases. For instance, in Kenya, Ghana, and as well as Zimbabwe, this form of inheritance normally occurs along the patrilineal lines, although in some instances along the matrilineal lines. Some of these land inheritance practices limits women's access to land. For instance, the transfer of land through the patrilineal line empowers the male child more than it does to the girl child. So, for example, land will be inherited from the father to the son. So, in such the mother's lineage is the source of matrilineal inheritance. But we realize that there are some societies in Africa, especially in Ghana, where matrilineal influence is quite stronger. But this is not to say that women have more leverage over land, but the land will be passed through the material lines, but the rights now are mostly in the hands of the male. Land could also be acquired through gifts. This would usually happen for when a stranger stays in a certain community, and they will be given land over a number of years. It could also be acquired through outright purchase. This system mainly favors male members of the society, who in most cases have economic muscle over the women counterparts. This is the disadvantage now of this land tenure system, because most women don't have the resources to acquire land. So we move on to the challenges that are associated with women's lack of access to land. This worsens their socio-economic status in the societies. And also, women's land insecurity negatively affects their production levels, as the majority live in constant fear of being evicted. So since most of them don't own land, they use it land because they might be investing in male counterparts. So the issue is on ownership rights. Women also lack the collateral security. This will in turn affects their capacity to access loan facilities and capital to invest in that land. So this disempowerment now will fuel conflicts over the land use and ownership rights, which then lead us to attempts to resolve this. Okay, so it shows that land build under the alternative justice systems. So this, by alternative justice systems, we simply refer to the administration of justice by the and beliefs to resolve disputes. So by disputes now, our focus is on land disputes. So we attempt to explore how the AJS play a role in resolving land conflicts. So the benefits now of the structure of this AGS, it is primarily focused on voluntary submission of a dispute for settlement. That is how it functions. And there will be prior agreement for the parties involved to be bound by the outcome of the settlement. there is also due observation of the rules of natural justice in this AGS mechanism. There's also there's need for compliance with the rules on the jurisdiction. So we also move on to the strength of AGS in resolving disputes related to land in these countries.
2 minutes
AGS,
left,
they are,
will be summarizing.
all right, thank you so much. AGS are instrumental in uniting communities as opposed to our formal systems of justice. So we have a case from Kenya where AGS played a part in uniting the parties that had been involved in a land conflict. So in Zimbabwe, also saw people acknowledging how AGS is playing a key role in trying to resolve these land-related disputes, regardless of gender. But however, we also notice some weaknesses in AGS structures. One of those key issues relates to the failure to provide room for women as decision makers. So this has an effect on the outcome of judgments because women are not involved in the decision-making processes. Okay. There's also persistence of patriarchy in the inheritance processes. So property is normally passed on through the male lines at the detriment of wives and daughters. For example, in Ghana, one research participant lamented how AGS was involved in the eviction from land by the husband's brother. So this shows how AGS structures are male dominated, as well as that which will influence the judgments passed. Okay, so in summation, I would say we need to establish dispute resolution mechanisms that are accessible and responsive to the needs of women at all levels, raise awareness on the importance of equitable access to justice and land regardless of one's gender. We also need to educate women about the importance of being actively involved in alternative justice systems structures. Also, we also need to come up with policies that ensure easy access to unbiased dispute resolution. So I would say this is the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Samuel, for this interesting presentation. I'll move ahead to invite the next presenter, Nicholas. Nicholas, would like to unmute and share your screen. Nicholas.
Thank you, Dr. Agatha Aridri.
You're welcome.
I'm happy to be here and thank you for chairing us. I am Nicholas Tunanuche, and my presentation is just a contribution to the citizenship debate in Uganda. Yeah. So we realize that in 1894, Uganda actually became Uganda. It was declared a British protectorate. And by 1926, the shape of Uganda as a country was like this, as displayed on the screen here. So we have the western region comprising of Kigezi, Ankole, Toro, then and Bunyoro. Then we have, this should have been actually the southern Uganda, as you can see, but because of constructionism, this one is called Central Uganda. Isn't it interesting, you think? Then this is Eastern Uganda and this is Northern Uganda. So my talk tonight will focus on Western Uganda and how it has grappled with the issue of citizenship, the issue of belonging. As I put forward, one event in 2002 took place in Western Uganda in a district called Chibare, which is in Greater Bunyoro, and many academicians have always called this conflict to be an ethnic conflict. It was a post-election conflict which involved the head or the head of the district trying to vie for the chairmanship of the district, and then another contendant who was believed to be belonging to another ethnic group called the Bachiga. The Bachiga are of Chigezi, as we said. So by the virtue of this country, Uganda, it would mean that whoever was a resident or is a resident of this country is ipso facto a citizen of Uganda. However, as from the experience of 2002 and so many other incidences we can refer to, migration from one region, one ethno-linguistic region to another raises the forces of nativism. Now, here comes the terminology of the Bafurchi and the natives. So that means that the native Banyoro in Chibare looked at themselves as the natives, the autochthons, the sons of and daughters of the soil, and the migrants Bafurchi, the migrants, the Bachiga, now became the Bafurchi. Bafurchi to mean migrants. But why does it come at a point in history, at this 2002, when in actual sense, migration has always been in place? For instance, in the process of the peopling of Uganda, we can trace out 3 waves of migration. The pre-colonial migration, where we have the Bantu, Luo, Ateke, and the Sudanics. So that means that indeed the western part of the country is largely inhabited by the Bantu. In any case, when a Munyoro speaks, a Muchiga hears 90% of what a Munyoro speaks. And when a Muchiga speaks, a Munyoro is likely to hear also 90% of what the Muchiga speaks. So in that way, in my view, that would have been a cohesive force of bringing about the national unity, but not the divisive mechanism to identify that one group is a native group and another is a migrant group, and leading to conflicts which are seemingly ethnic, and yet, in my view, it should have been a converging force, a peaceful coexistence. I bring out, for instance, this later in order to mirror what took place in the 1950s. This is a letter of 1955, which was written by the king of Bunyoro, who is the Mukama, or who was called the Mukama, and was inviting, for instance, the Wachiga to come over into Bunyoro and stay with them. The reason or reasons could have been quite many, but then why are these seemingly ethnic conflicts coming in 2000, not in 1950s, when most of the Wachiga came in? It is therefore the question of resources. The question of resources, and also the major identity issues, the struggle to maintain the primordial identity indicators like language, like norms, make the seemingly ethnic conflicts at the forefront and leads to more questions of citizenship very recurrent. So what do I take out from that? I conclude that the conflicts in the Ugandan communities exemplified by the Bafurchi and the Banyoro is more than just a ethnic related conflict, to a conflict within the theory and practice of citizenship. Therefore, within Uganda, an average Ugandan has two kinds of citizenship. One, local citizenship that is bestowed upon by the virtue of where one is born, that is the ancestry, and that one takes the precedent. And the second one, which is national, the one that is formal and which is in form of a theoretical perception. For instance, people in Chibari, when I was doing the interviews there, people of Chibari look at each other as either Banyoro or Wachiga, when there is the need that makes them identify themselves as so. For instance, when it comes to a political issue that comes in, who is standing, a Muchiga or a Munyoro? And then the mobilization goes into those when there are no issues, then they look at each other as brothers and sisters. Now, for me, I would like to assert that in order to solve the pending conflicts, which have been summarily referred to as ethnic conflicts, they should be approached from the historical roots which have made these communities the way they are. And migration stands out. In that way, then in the struggle for a decentralization process, people should first of all and foremost be identified from their ancestry and then brought together into a nation that can be called Uganda. The fact that the Ugandan state, since the colonial period, has failed to bring to bring that thread together into one, justifies the need to maintain the ancestry first of all and the identity, and then use them into national unison. If that is not made, there is a likelihood, as Richard asserts, of a genocide that is seen as a cynic genocide, but when in actual sense, it is a conflict of belonging or a conflict of citizenship. I thank you very much for this short talk, and I hope to hear from you people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for this presentation. It's quite exciting. And for those who have questions, please keep on asking the questions in the chat. I take this opportunity to invite the last presenter or presenters, Dr. Zaidi Sechito and Nakaiza Jacqueline. You are most welcome to present. You will take 10 minutes and then the rest we finish as discussions, Q&A.
Okay, I think I'm there. Hi, everyone. I'm called Jacqueline Nakaiza, a PhD fellow at the Department of History and History. I'm sorry for my voice. I'm struggling with allergies and I'm still adjusting, so that is why I may sound a bit low, but I'm going to present about African solutions to African problems, and we are inquiring whether it is political snowgaring or African Renaissance. The whole concept of African solutions and African problems comes starts up maybe right after independence in the early 60s, after the independence from most African countries in the early 60s. And this is when they realized that maybe they need to be cooperate for the continent's socioeconomic development and have more solidarity, work towards a brighter future and more brotherhood generally. But as this picture depicts it, those of you who have been to Dakar, you must have seen it. It is the monument of African Renaissance, where the African countries strongly emphasize African brotherhood and solidarity generally to overcome the challenges that the continent faces. And this concept was most popularized by Thabo Mbeki and authors like Ali Mazrui. Yeah?
Do you mind giving me some food and I eat from here?
Hello?
Need some food and
Yes, maybe I had a disruption, but let me go on.
Nicholas, you like to mute? Thank you.
So that is the whole essence of African Renaissance, and with that realization, then that is when Africans come up to say Africans should have a way of solving African problems. And at the beginning of this month, we had a coup that took place in Guinea. And as most of us are aware, or those who have been following global events, and this kind of captured my attention, where Charles Onyango Bo made this commentary. So African Union suspended Guinea over the coup, right? But why does it embrace incumbents who steal elections, rewrite constitutions to rule for life, and torment, pillage, and impoverish their countries, the conditions that lead to the coups in the first place? And as we talk about African solutions and African problems, our own very president asked, what is Africa's problem? Of course, we all know that as a continent, we are grappling with so many problems, but these include insecurity. We have insecurity in terms of wars spread all over the continent. We have poor governance, which is maybe also that eventually leads into coups. We have corruption, we have diseases. Right now, we are grappling with the COVID scourge, and then we also grappled seriously with HIV/AIDS. And unfortunately, as African, we may not be able to unite to come up with a united effort to fight against COVID, or to come up with a way of developing our own vaccines and dealing with this problem of COVID as a continent, or as one being. So we have other problems like climate change, we have drought and famine. Of course, these contribute to African problems and to the conflict. Then we have poverty, we have the exacerbated refugee crisis in the continent. So all these are African problems and others that the continent grapples with. And after talking about or defining the African problems, then we come to say, what are the African solutions to these African problems? And as my cartoon depicts here, we have a conflict ongoing in Central African Republic. We have a conflict in South Sudan. The Great Lakes region, as we know, has been surrounded by conflicts for years, for decades. And then when we talk about African problems needing African solutions, here they are saying this particular, and from the cartoonist, these are heads of different heads of state. I can see Kagame here, I can see Museveni, and these are saying, the leaders are saying, we need more aid, foreign aid, more troops. But what problems are we trying to deal with? We are trying to deal with poverty eradication. We are trying to deal with peace, security, and democracy. We are trying to deal with political governance, and we are trying to deal with sustainable development. But then, as Onyango Bo had earlier said, how do we deal with this when we are sustaining leaders or that do actions that actually lead to coups themselves? And for this particular write-up, we shall be focusing on the Somalia crisis and looking at how African solutions have tried to deal with this crisis. You may or you may not know, but Somalia has had a civil war which started in the late 80s that is still ongoing, much as it keeps on changing face or changing different actors and metamorphosing into different things or the way it is handled. And then since at the beginning of 1991, the central government in Somalia collapsed, and since then there has been no functional central government, much as there is a federal government of Somalia currently, but it is not a government that covers. It's a government in some places that is there during the day, and in some places that is only in urban centers, but doesn't cover peri-urban areas and rural areas. And from about 2014, there has been a stalemate between the federal government of Somalia and the AMISOM forces, which fight alongside the federal government of Somalia and the Al-Shabaab militants. And we talk about the Somali crisis, then we ask, what is the role of AU's ideology of African solutions in the Somali crisis. We also ask African Union's role in conflict resolution, not only in Somalia, but generally in Africa, because the continent has a continent is covered with conflicts. From what I have here, there has been a lot of, generally, even when we are talking about African solutions and African problems, Somalia as a country has had a lot of interventions, even before actually 2004. But in 2000, actually from around 1991, 1992, IGAD and with the support of United Nations undertook different peace conferences to try and re-establish a central government. But in 2004, IGAD decided to deploy peacekeeping troops in Somalia, much as this did not materialize, but that initiative was there. Then in 2006, Ethiopia deployed her troops or invaded Somalia as a whole to try and maintain peace and restore the central government. But with the backlash of the Ethiopian invasion in Somalia, then we have AMISOM, or the African Union, deploying her troops under AMISOM in 2007. And the intervention that Africa as a region has mostly had in Somalia has been focusing on the humanitarian aspect, because there has been generally a very long humanitarian crisis since 1991 that led to the spilling of refugees all over the neighboring countries, that has led to famine, droughts, and so there has been that humanitarian intervention. Then the region has focused to try and rebuild the state in Somalia, which process is still ongoing. Then they've also tried to re-establish peace, and that is why they deployed the AMISOM troops in Somalia, and then to counter terrorism. And our question is, when you talk about African solutions to African problems, is it political snoggerying or African renaissance? The desire by African countries to come and solve the continent's problems. And then here we have this dilemma, the resources versus ideology. Reality is this whole concept of African solutions, African problem, reads very, very nice and sounds great, because as a people, we should be able to deal with the challenges that we are grappling with. Unfortunately, it is evident that even when we come up with this African solutions to African problems ideal or ideology, we cannot, as a continent so far, we do not have the, when we talk about Somalia, we do not have the military capacity to, like the armament, the equipment to deploy effectively in Somalia. We do not even have the trained personnel to deploy in Somalia. Even the funding itself that is funding AMISOM is not African. It is not African funded. The mission itself as AMISOM and all the interventions, plus all these peace conferences that have been taking place over the years, these have been funded by the US mainly, the European Union, the United Nations, and other top world countries. And to be able to respond to these different questions that we are raising, our study is majorly qualitative, where we shall carried partly, and we shall still carry on key informant interviews with African peace and security experts. Then we shall also look at literary discourses on African indigenous and indigenous conflict resolution mechanisms. And I think that is it for now. That is all that I can present for now. I thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jacqueline, for presenting and finishing the presentation on time. Thank you so much. It's a very interesting paper, and we look forward to seeing the final results, publications. Now I'll open up the Q&A session. I've tried checking in the chat. I don't see any question. For those who have questions, by show of hand, raise your hand, and we give you the platform to ask the question to any of the presenters. We will take about 15 minutes for the Q&A. Jacqueline, would you like to stop sharing? Jacqueline, would you like to stop sharing your screen? Thank you. Yes, we are now in the session for Q&A. Questions are welcome by show of hands. No show of hands, no questions. No questions. Yes, Nicholas has a question. Nicholas would like to ask a question. Mention the name of the presenter you're asking, directing the question to.
Thank you, Dr. Agatha. It is not a question per se.
Yes.
But it is just a comment on Dr. Corey's presentation. I am actually very impressed by the presentation and the issue of the refugee crisis in Eastern Africa. Of course, here in Uganda, we also have so many Burundi, and even as far as early as 1950s. Actually, in my studies in Uganda, I found some Burundi migrants to have been there as early as 1922. So, Dr. Corey, is there any links to do with camping of those refugees or migrants of some sort? And if so, how is life in the camps? Or are there Barundi to collaborate or even taken up by some ethnic groups in Tanzania and Uganda? Thank you.
Yes, Corey, would you like to respond?
Okay, thank you very much, Nicholas, for your question. And perhaps I'm not going to answer it directly, but you know, as you were speaking, it made me think, and listening to all the other presentations in this panel, it made me think of how you know, we're really sitting with the effect of the colonial legacy and colonial borders. That, you know, to some extent, it's this issue of refugees and migrants, but isn't part of the problem the very fact that we are so limited in the way that we think about how the nation state functions and citizenship. For example, I remember when I was doing research in Rwanda, some of the people from Rwanda that were refugees in Uganda for a long time, and they became part of the RPF that violently you know, returned to Rwanda in 1994. They were saying that they wouldn't have returned to Rwanda if they could get citizenship in Uganda. You know, they would never have made the move back to Rwanda. They were happy in Uganda. It was just this issue of citizenship. And if there had been an East African citizenship, they would never need to have moved anywhere. And it made me wonder if part of the problem is that we are so stuck in thinking about these countries and nation states instead of thinking about the region. If we had an East African citizenship, would most of these problems would maybe be resolved. if people could simply live and work and be educated in any country in East Africa, for example, without having to worry about which country they belong to. So this is just something I was thinking, because it feels to me like so much suffering is happening because of people being limited in terms of their citizenship. And then again, also, if we think about these colonial boundaries and how some groups of people were divided, as we know, ethnic groups and language groups were just randomly and arbitrarily divided by these borders, especially around the Banyarwanda and so on. And Burundi, there were a lot of people who were simply pushed into Uganda or pushed into Tanzania or pushed into Rwanda or Burundi, even though the people from their same clans were left on the other side of the border. So it's to me, it seems to be questions of citizenship, but certainly the conditions, I don't know what is worse, the conditions for those who remained in the camps or settlements in neighboring countries, or those who returned to Burundi, because either way, it seems to me that livelihood and land remains a challenge, whether you stay as a refugee or whether you return. Conditions are tough, was my impression. I hope I kind of answered your question, Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you very much for your response. Corey, I also have one question for you. The question relates to the Land Commission. According to your presentation, according to the Land Commission, land was to be divided equally between the landowner and the returnee. I just wanted to know who were these landowners and who were the returnees? What was the power relations between the two? And what was their relation with the state? That I will be so interested in knowing. Thank you very much, Corey.
It's a very good question, Agatha, and I'm not sure I have the answer. But as far as I'm aware, and this is why ethnicity isn't necessarily the issue here, that ethnically, the landowner and the returnee could both be Hutu. But it's in some cases, the ones who fled are more likely to be Hutu because it was the Tutsi government, the Tutsi minority, who were causing people to flee between the 1970s and the 1990s. So most of those who would have fled would be Hutus. And most of those, some of those who took over the land in their absence would be Tutsi and some would be Hutu. So it would be a mix. And so the ones that are returning, this is the interesting thing with ethnicity in Burundi is, so the Tutsi were in power for the longest period of time, and they are the minority group. And now after 2005, the Hutu came into power. And I think many Hutu thought that they would be advantaged once there was a Hutu government in power. But instead what happened is everybody continued to suffer in the same level of poverty as they always had. And I think that's, well, some scholars say that that's the reason why people stopped worrying about ethnicity, because they realized, it doesn't matter who's in power, we're going to be poor. And, there's no advantages either way. So my sense was that the people that returned, that they had the same relationship to power as the ones who were the kind of the new landowners. So yeah, they have, as far as I understand, they have equal access to power and equal access to the state. So that the dispute is really about who should be receiving that land, the ones who've been living there for the past 30 years, or the ones that left 30 years ago but owned the land for hundreds of years. And that's the dispute that remains.
Yeah, thank you so much, Corey, for bringing up that complexity in ethnicity, politics, and land ownership. Mm-hmm. Nicholas, your hand is up. Would like to ask or comment?
I know there is Dr. Edgar Taylor instead.
Okay, are you sharing the same screen?
No. But you can accept him. My question I asked, and Professor Corey responded to it, except if you would like me to respond to Pauline Ariho.
Yes, do so.
Yeah, the question to me is to comment on the issue of Banyarwanda and the Abavandimwe citizenship in Uganda and how this is linked to inequality. I do appreciate this question, and I think Professor Corey mentioned about how the Banyarwanda have found their way into Uganda, but I would like to put it quite a little bit historical, because as I presented, though I intentionally left out this migrant labor phenomenon as the second wave of migration, is that it is in the whole process of migrancy during the colonial project, the Belgians and in the nearby here, Rwanda and much of Congo, the conditions of 1920s, even as early as 1919, compelled many of the Banyarwanda to enter into Uganda as migrant laborers. The unique future of the Banyarwanda migrant laborers is that for them, they stayed in Uganda, and particularly in Uganda, which was a cash crop zone. And so they offered their labor, and they were into tenants. Others are called got incorporated into the Buganda culture. And the Baganda are very interesting. They are hospitable, but they are not accommodative. Hospitable, if you would like to change into become a Muganda, you can become. Indeed, Richards identified many of the Banyarwanda immigrants to have become Baganda. They become Baganda during the day, and at night you hear them speak Chinyarwanda. In short, of course, that becomes very interesting. I talk about accommodative, non-accommodative in a sense that you are not welcomed as say, a Chori, and you stay with the Baganda. The Baganda would want you to adopt to be Chigandanized, and that is a traditional form of power, because numbers meant much. It meant extension into other. That's what they used to do for Bunyoro and Ankole in the neighborhood. For instance, during the colonial period in Bunyoro, the official language was supposed to be Luganda. and they forced even the parents to give names belonging or having the distinction of Uganda or Chiganda culture, when in actual sense they were Abanyoro. They could not receive baptism, for instance, a sacrament in the church. So as long as you never had a name belonging to Buganda. That aside, now the question of Abavandimwe. Now the Banyarwanda in that early period, 1919, 1920, up to 1930s, they lived as tenant labor. In Uganda. The report indicated that the Banyarwanda in Uganda were the 6th largest in number. And Dr. Kori also referred about the territorialization. Many of the people in around actually in Kigezi, around Mount Mufumbira, many of them have their ties with Rwanda, and some of them are called Banyarwanda in terms of ethnic grouping. They become the Banyarwanda tribe, and that name Banyarwanda has something to do with the country court. I think the element of Bavandimwe, when it comes to the citizenship question in Uganda now, becomes very recurrent and very interesting. Because when you say we are giving citizenship to Banyarwanda, it infers then to the people of Rwanda. But when they become Bavandimwe as a separate ethnic group, I think the movement now or the equation now becomes balanced. They can claim very well indigeneity in the country. That is a very long debate. I would like to give other people opportunity to comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for that intriguing discussion. And it's clear that citizenship is socially and politically constructed. However, I'll leave you with one question. Nativism is a colonial construction. It's a colonial invention. Does the term still bear the same meaning to date? That is a question we can continue the discussion with. I saw Samuel's hand up. Samuel, you have withdrawn it. Samuel, I had a question for you. I like the way you approached the gender dynamics in land, and then the gender binary you brought up. My question was, do men also face challenges in accessing land? And what kind of land are you talking about? Yes, Samuel, unmute and respond. Someone would like to unmute. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. You raised a question on what type of land. The focus is on rural land. So that is what I'm focusing on. And then I missed the first part of the question, sorry.
I was just appreciating the binary the gender binary you presented between female and male. That was good.
All right, okay, so, all right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I also had a question for Jacqueline. Jacqueline, your presentation was so interesting. African solution to African problems. What is the problem of Africa? You did identify the problems ranging from insecurity, corruption, climate change. And then my question is Africa's problem internal or external? What is the origin of Africa's problem before you identify the solution? To me, I think what you are presenting are symptoms of the disease of the problem. What is the origin of the problem? How will Africa solve Africa's problem without knowing the origin? Thank you so much. Would you like to respond to that? Jackie, are you there?
Yes, thank you. I think Africa's problem is embedded within its political, social, and economic stratum that we took on after independence. That is, I think that is where the major problem starts from.
Okay, thank you. Albert, are you still there?
Yes.
Albert Lupinda.
Yes.
Yeah, I would like to thank you for your presentation.
Yes.
I see how you have historicized pastoralism. It's so interesting. And my question is, at what point does pastoralism become a political tool? Because somewhere I could see you mentioned something on how some of the conflicts are politically linked. Thank you. If
Okay,
I
thank
got
you.
well.
That's okay. At times, when we look at the pastoral areas, in most cases, it's surely political, and especially like the conflicts that take place in those particular regions, because you find that most of those regions are always marginalized. And the political leaders who come from those areas, because of that marginalization, whenever they always instrumentalize that issue of marginalization in terms of mobilization of the people from that particular area. And maybe a good example could be the case of Kenya, where some politicians have always been accused of sponsoring the violence taking place within the pastoral regions. So you find that it's an issue that is being instrumentalized by the politicians rather than being addressed by the government of the day. So it continues to disfigure the relationship between the pastoral communities and the state, where the pastoral communities see the state as the enemy and they do not recognize the state because the state has marginalized them. So there are two enemies. So it's about politics that is defined by the climatic regions that prevail in the pastoral areas or their mode of production.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Our time is up. I would like to thank all the panelists present, and I really enjoyed following your papers. And to Dr. Mayende, thank you so much. And at this time, we should be going back to the main room to join the closing session. I see Samuel's hand is up.
Yes, yes, Agada.
Yes, please.
Unfortunately, it is already
sorry,
time.
Dr. Agada.
Kindly, we need to close at this point.
Yeah, Samuel, my apologies. We should be joining the main group. Thank you so much.
All right. Yeah.
We can continue with the conversation. Okay. Have a good afternoon. Thank you so much. It was nice sharing the session. Bye-bye.